You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. As Roland Martin Unfiltered. By going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com, you can make this possible. We know Mississippi got a long history and a problem with black people. Now a group of black voters, they're challenging Mississippi's racist Jim Crow era laws. They say they try to give an advantage to white candidates running for statewide office. And this is going to be critically important for the upcoming governor's election that is expected to totally remake the state's redistricting process. The suit is being filed by former Attorney General Eric Holder's group, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Now, again, what they're saying in Mississippi is that the Mississippi laws specifically disenfranchise black voters. Joining us right now is Marina Jenkins, Litigation Director for the National Redistricting Foundation. So, Marina, first of all, I'm trying to understand, what's your argument? How are Mississippi laws hurting black people running for statewide office?
Sure. So it's an interesting, first of all, thank you so much for having me and for talking about this very important issue. We really appreciate your attention to this case. These provisions, it's a series of provisions that were instituted as part of the 1890 Mississippi Constitutional Convention. The purpose of the state coming together and creating a new constitution in 1890 was a response to the Reconstruction era, in which African Americans actually started really using their political power and gaining statewide office and gaining a lot of political power. And so in 1890, they sort of came together and said, what are the different ways that we can come up to stop this? Some of the more common, well-known provisions are the literacy test or a poll tax. This is a slightly more complicated scheme in which, in order for a candidate to win statewide office, you have to win both the popular vote across the state, and you also have to win the electoral vote, which is essentially winning by a plurality of votes in each House district, a majority of the House districts. So you have to win both half of all the House districts plus the majority, not even just a plurality, of the statewide popular vote.
Okay, so hold on one second. So what you're saying is that if you're running for statewide office in Mississippi, if you win the popular vote in the state, that's not good enough?
No.
Is that for any statewide position?
These are for statewide state positions.
So
it doesn't apply to
attorney
federal offices like Senate.
So does it apply to members, obviously Senate or members of Congress, right?
It does not apply to Senate, to U.S. Senate or members of Congress. So it does apply to the governor's office, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general, any statewide office.
Is there any other state in the union that does this?
There are a few others, but they are by far the vast minority of states that do this. Overwhelmingly, states use just whoever gets the most number of votes wins. And so that's what we are trying, that's what, the litigation is trying to get to. We're asking the court to say, the right thing to do is for this scheme to go away and for the people to actually vote on who becomes, who holds these offices. Because the thresholds that I mentioned before, you have to win a majority of statewide popular vote, plus you have to win a majority of the House districts. And if one person doesn't get both of those things, then the state House of Mississippi gets to just vote on who becomes, the elected official in that given office. And they don't have to respect the will of the voters, and they don't have to give that office to the person who gets the most votes.
And let's take it back. Let's go back to 1890. Anybody who just saw Skip Gates' piece on Reconstruction on PBS. At that 1890 Mississippi Constitutional Convention, all of the delegates were white except one. And that African American actually argued against giving black folks the right to vote in Mississippi because he was also protecting his financial interests because he was basically being funded by a number of rich white folks in Mississippi.
Yeah, it was a complicated period, and I think even today we are not free from, folks who have obtained power, trying to keep their power, notwithstanding what it does to the greater good. I think, to the extent that people try and use that fact to come in and say, oh, this wasn't actually racist because there was one person who voted for it, and so, therefore your argument is killed. I don't think that, we don't see that as being the final answer, but people back then and still today, sometimes just are looking out for, their own.
Henry, do me a favor. Go to my iPad, please. And so the gentleman I'm speaking of, his name is Isaiah T. Montgomery. And he, of course, was elected the only African-American who was at that particular convention. Marina, when we talk about this lawsuit, again, I mean, what you just described also does not speak to one man, one woman, one vote. And I think for a lot of people who don't quite understand when these policies were enacted, when you look at many of these states, the battle, and I've been saying this for years, the battle is in these state houses. And this is how Reverend Jackson always talks about, this is the old Confederacy literally maintaining power. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Louisiana. We see it in Florida as well. And these are all these different laws clearly put in place, whether it's 1890 or 1990, whether it's 2019, the target consistently are black people, because more than half of African Americans in the United States live in the South.
That's right. And I think in 1890, particularly, half of Mississippians were black. And to this day, Mississippi has the highest number of African Americans percentage-wise than any state in the country. And yet, because of this history of discrimination and history of voting suppression targeted at, the African American community in Mississippi, we haven't seen an African American win statewide office in Mississippi since 1890, despite the fact that they have the highest portion of African American residents of any state in the country.
But this also speaks to what I consistently say to folks, how we are impacted today by slavery and Jim Crow. I'm going to read this for you in this particular piece here. Henry, go to my iPad here. This is from the Mississippi History Archives. It says, Montgomery was also an astute political observer, and he understood the realities of power in his time and place. Enfranchised by the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, and technically allowed an equal opportunity to both vote and hold public office under the Mississippi Constitution of 1868. And this is the key line here. You talked about half, but this lays out blacks outnumbered whites in every decade from 1840 to 1940. So for 100 years, African Americans outnumbered whites in Mississippi. But because of that convention in 1890, you pretty much had black folks disenfranchised for 50 years when they outnumbered whites, and still to the present day.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, those provisions were incredibly successful in disenfranchising African Americans in Mississippi. And Mississippi was, in fact, the first, I believe, was the first, and a number of states sort of followed years down the line of doing these constitutional conventions and instituting provisions that would disenfranchise African Americans, because those numbers were a real threat to white power at that time.
So, you filed the lawsuit. Will it have any impact on November, or is the goal to impact 2020?
The goal is hopefully to impact 2019 elections. The legal team has filed a preliminary injunction motion, so hoping that the court moves this, along pretty quickly. I think, we're very hopeful that we can push quickly enough. Anyone who sort of has experience with litigation knows that these can be really long, drawn-out processes, but they can also move fast. And so we're trying to push it and move it quickly so that we can have some relief this year and get a court to say that in 2019 elections, because Mississippi does their election cycle differently for statewide office, so they do theirs in the odd number of years. So for 2019, that the statewide offices ought to be decided by whoever gets the top number of votes gets to win that office.
I take it, the last question for you. Are you also using the very explicit language of the individuals in 1890 against Mississippi today? This is the quote from S.S. Calhoun, who was the president of that convention. Quote, "We came here to exclude the Negro. Nothing short of this will answer." The president of the Constitutional Convention makes it clear the point of the convention was to keep black folks from voting.
Absolutely. In 1890, the folks who were involved made no secret of what their intention was, and they, talked about it during the convention. They spoke about it to the press. So we have a historian who's gone through all of that, and that is being integrated into this lawsuit to put that in front of the court.
All right, then. We certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much. Marina Jenkins, good luck.
Thank you.
All right, let's introduce our panel. Malik Abdul, Vice President, Black Conservative Federation. Kelly Bethea, Communication Strategist. Dr. Jason Nichols, African American Studies, University of Maryland. Malik, you from Mississippi?
I am.
This is clearly, this provision that they're laying out, specifically about black people, it was put in place to target black people, to limit black people's vote. Why should that continue in 2019?
I have to look a bit more into it. This is kind of the first I've heard of it, just on its face. I mean, I think that the state elections should follow the federal elections. I think
which means the person who gets the most vote wins,
right.
Versus this whole convoluted, you can win the popular vote, but you got to win the electoral, and that's like all over the place.
Yeah, but that very good point. I think they should be consistent. So I'll just start out by saying that I think they really should be consistent with how they do the congressional and Senate races. Whether or not now in 2019 the barrier to more black people winning statewide office is this particular 1890s law or provision, I don't know. And I say that if we look at statewide offices, or at least on the federal level, around the country. So whether it's the one representative that we have in Louisiana, the 4 or so that we have, 4, maybe 5 in California, the 3 or so in Maryland, the 4 or so in Georgia. We don't have a lot of black people that have been elected statewide.
How many
office.
have you had in Mississippi?
Well, we have one. That's Benny Thompson.
No. He's not elected statewide.
Well, I'm sorry. Well, he's a congressman.
But he's not statewide.
You're right. And
so how many Mississippi are statewide?
The lady on the show said that there were none. But
right.
I don't know how
you're
that
from
compares.
Mississippi.
Right, but I mean, I don't know about statewide. Okay.
No, there's zero.
And I
when
accept that.
is the last African American elected statewide in Mississippi?
I forgot what she said.
1890. Blanche Bruce.
Yeah, but I don't know how that compares to any other state.
No, that's.
I don't know how that compares to.
That actually
Alabama, Georgia. I mean, I don't know how that compares.
Well at all. And the reality is, Blanche Bruce was not elected statewide. It was chosen by the legislature. This is the United States Senate.
Yes.
Yeah. Kelly, the thing here is, again, this is one of those things when you talk about history, how people don't quite understand and don't want to accept. So I love all these people who say, y'all stop bringing up slavery. Y'all stop bringing up stuff from the 1800s. But this is how you look at these constitutions and how white supremacy was placed into the Constitution to limit African Americans. That's exactly what this is.
That's exactly what this is. And the fact that a lot of this has to deal with structural racism. People say, like you said, that racism is over. Obama was president, therefore, blacks are equal, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the case. This is a clear-cut case of not only de jure segregation, but de facto segregation by way of what the head of the convention in 1890 said, like, the point of this entire situation is to block black people from voting and to regain their citizenship or have citizenship at all. Maryland actually went through something similar, not necessarily in terms of voter disenfranchisement, but just to give you an example of a de jure segregation case, the HBCU case in Maryland that came down almost 10 years ago, but the final decision was within the last 2-3 years, saying that there was still de jure segregation in the books. So, you know, Mississippi isn't the only one. Mississippi is definitely a blatant example.
Dr. Alvin Chambliss was the one who also successfully sued Mississippi and their HBCUs. That all went all the way up to the Supreme Court, deal with the funding as well. Jason, I want to read this item here. This is quite interesting. And I'm focusing on his brother, Isaiah Montgomery. In time, Montgomery had second thoughts about his sublime sacrifice of 1890. He lived another 34 years, long enough to admit privately, though never in public, to a sense of betrayal, to a recognition that white supremacists in Mississippi sought, quote, nothing less than a retrogression of the Negro back towards serfdom and slavery. In a letter to Booker T. Washington, he acknowledged that white talk of pure government was a sham, and only armed federal intervention could restore colorblind democracy in Mississippi. And then, his was interesting, he died in 1924, eulogized by a conservative white planter politician, laid to rest in a tomb paid for by white subscription. But this is the line that says it all. Outside his circle of family and friends, he was largely unmourned. By that date, he was, in the words of a northern missionary, more hated by Negroes than any other Mississippian of his race.
So, you know, I have a little bit of empathy for Isaiah Montgomery.
Got none.
And here's why. Here's why. You are the only black man in a room full of white, powerful men in 1890 in Mississippi. What decision are you going to make for the best interest, in the best interest of your family? We know, you know, what it was like in the civil rights movement.
But here's the problem. He was in the room not solely because of his family. The reality, and see, this is why I speak about being a politician. He was in the room as a delegate for the people. He wasn't there just to protect his personal economic interests. What he did was validate white supremacy. He literally argued it's okay to take the vote away from the Negroes because they ain't ready.
Now, look, I definitely agree on his face. I'm just saying the level of intimidation. We know Mississippi is a place where there was strange fruit for the next, you know, several decades in Mississippi. We know what happened to Emmett Till, you know, 60 years after he cast that vote. So in a room full of powerful white men,
okay,
as a black man,
be elected, don't serve.
I mean,
but there was a generation of black men. But remember, while he was doing that, there were black folks who represented that state in the United States Senate. All I'm simply saying is what we have to recognize is, even today in 2019, you might be the only one in the room, but you ain't representing just you.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree.
And what we have here is a clear design, and I hope this lawsuit is successful, because what it should do is absolutely expose how Jim Crow laws, which were designed to keep black folks from voting, are still impacting black folks in 2019.
Right.
Whether it's Mississippi or some other state, and that to me is, I think, what's critically important.
Right. And let me just say one last thing, and that is, for people who say that it was a long time ago, I always remind my students that Ruby Bridges is not old enough to retire yet.
Right.
She's 64. She can't even retire yet. You know what I mean? So
got it.
When we talk about civil rights, it was not a long time ago, but I do think that there is a difference between 2019 and 1890 in Mississippi.
But if
definitely it is.
Well, but
I grew
again,
up there, I know.
If the law is still on the books,
Right.
get rid of the law.
Absolutely.
Right.
And we're all in agreement there.
But there is no guarantee
Which requires
will start
white
winning
Republicans
statewide.
to change the Constitution. And that is a whole different conversation. We know how they feel about that flag.
Well, they very well may change the Constitution. I remain unconvinced. I remain unconvinced that if they do change that, then somehow black people statewide in Mississippi would be elected any more than they are.
Well, you can say that.
Well,
you can say that.
That's not not the case on the
Mississippi is
congressional
38%
side.
black.
Okay.
You
And
can,
that's great. And
one
on the
second,
congressional
you can
side-
say that. Henry, go to my iPad. This is a New York Times article from 1985 when a 350-member biracial commission began to say that Bureau Convention. That was in 1985. The Constitution hasn't been changed. Trust me, Malik, they will not change it. All right, folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment. Hey guys, they're back. MarijuanaStock.org has another great investment opportunity. If you were lucky enough to invest in their last crowdfunding campaign, you know they raised a lot of money in just a few months investing in legal marijuana farms. And those initial investors now own shares of a publicly traded company. And they're certainly making things happen. Now, last time, again, many of you missed out, but now you can connect this time. They have a new investment opportunity that is as good, if not even better, than the last one. I'm talking about industrial hemp CBD. For those who don't know, the hemp plant is the cousin to marijuana with a much higher concentration of CBD, which means hemp CBD gives you all of the medical benefits of marijuana without getting you high. Now, until recently, hemp farming was practically illegal in the United States and heavily regulated by the DEA. However, the 2018 Farm Bill changed all of that, making it legal to grow hemp CBD in the U.S. and creating one of the largest commodities worldwide. They need land to grow all of the plants, which makes for an incredible investment opportunity, and that's where our good friends at 420 Real Estate come in. Their business model is simple. They buy land that supports hemp CBD grow operations and lease it to licensed, high-paying tenants. That's right, they are hemp CBD landlords, and you can get in on the action. You can invest in this crowdfunding campaign for as little as $200 up to $10,000. Trust me, you don't want to miss out. To invest, go to marijuanastock.org. That's marijuanastock.org to get in the game and do it now. Now back to your Roland Martin Unfiltered video.